Hey everybody, this is Ross Izzard, and this is the Backcountry Fly Fishing Podcast, where we talk about fly fishing in more interesting places. So last week you got sort of a glimpse into the soul of Ross. Not that you needed that or asked for it, but I thought that it might be helpful for you to learn a little bit more about who the guy on the other end of the microphone is, how I got here, why I love backcountry fly fishing, and just sort of my heart and my mind for this particular activity that we share. So I hope you enjoyed that. I know it's a little bit different. We're going to spend a lot of time looking at more detailed subjects. But before we do that, I am glad that we got to know each other a little bit. So hopefully you feel the same way. This week, we're going to dive in with a little bit more high-level stuff related to backcountry fly fishing. So, I know a lot of people have a lot of questions. One of the early questions that I usually get is what exactly counts as backcountry fly fishing? So when we're talking about fishing, when does it count as backcountry? So does it count as backcountry if you have to walk 20 feet from your car? How about if you were to park and walk half a mile from your car? What about if you're fishing in a stream that runs right along the backside of a log cabin? So there are a lot of scenarios that you could come up with here for what does and doesn't constitute backcountry. And I'm going to preface my definition by saying that the truth is nobody really cares, right? If you feel like what you're doing is backcountry and you want to call it backcountry, you can call it backcountry. So I'm aware of the fact that there are going to be some people out there who take issue with my definition of it. You can probably find some way to poke holes in it if you really want to, but who cares, right? Why would you? Backcountry can be what you want it to be. I will tell you what I think backcountry fly fishing is, and that way you know, just in general, as we go forward with these discussions, when I say backcountry fly fishing, this is what I mean. So here it is. Here's the big definition. I think backcountry fly fishing is any fly fishing that you do that requires specialized non-fishing equipment to access. Okay? So think about that for a second. Any type of fly fishing that you do that requires specialized non-fishing equipment to access. There are a whole bunch of different ways that you can slice that, right? We can't define backcountry fly fishing as just stuff that you hike to, because there are scenarios where you have to take some really rough, gnarly 4x4 road 20 miles out into the wilderness so that you can hop out and fish a stream that's 10 yards from the car. You can't necessarily say that driving to something counts as backcountry fly fishing in terms of distance from civilization. That may or may not matter. You can't say that it involves how many people are around you. There are certain parts of the U.S. and certain regions where you may have people around you, even in really remote areas, 20 or 30 miles out into the wilderness. There are other places where you could be, 1,000 yards from a town and never see anybody. So it can't be that. And I think really it ultimately has to come down to equipment, right? The dividing line. So if you can go out to a river, you drive out there in your Toyota Camry, you park, you get out, you put on your hip pack or your chest pack or whatever, even a day pack, and you put on your wading boots and you get in the river and you fish. That's not backcountry fly fishing, right? So you drove out there in a regular car on a regular road to use regular fishing stuff to fish in a regular place. That's fine. Even if you drove 100 miles to get there, probably still not backcountry in my book. But if you had to go out to a parking lot, maybe you drove the same Toyota Camry, you parked in a lot. I actually just did this week. Then you put on a backpacking backpack because you needed enough space to carry your tent and your water filter and your extra clothes and your bear canister. That counts as backcountry, right? You're having to carry non-fishing equipment, in this case, backpacking and camping gear, to get where you're going. That counts as backcountry. If you don't bring those things, you can't access the fishing. It's just the way it is. Same thing goes with hiking stuff, right? If you're going someplace where you can probably just slap on your wading boots and waders and walk in, there might be some scenarios where that looks like backcountry. I've certainly done some long hikes in that stuff. But in general, if you have to bring a separate set of hiking boots because you are going to be hiking a fairly long distance into a spot, that probably is backcountry. The hiking boots in that instance are the specialized equipment. Or going back to a previous example, if you are going to be fishing 10 feet from your car in a stream, but getting to that stream requires you to go up a very rough, long 4x4 road. I actually have done a little bit of this summer myself. You've got to have a specialized high clearance 4x4 vehicle with good tires and everything else, good shocks. That's specialized equipment, right? In that case, even if you are just going to fish in your chest pack and whatever, you had to use a piece of specialized equipment to get there. That counts as backcountry. So that's kind of where we're coming from with this stuff is if you have to carry or use anything that is not necessarily fishing related with you, that's backcountry fly fishing. And like I said, I know you can poke a bunch of holes in this. You can say, well, I carry a backpack and you don't necessarily have to carry a backpack fly fishing. Okay, that's fine. I bring hiking boots even if I don't really need hiking boots because I like to put on dry shoes later. Okay, that's fair. I drove my Toyota Camry up a road that was definitely not made for Toyota Camrys, and I got there just fine. Fine. That's fine too. There are a lot of scenarios that you can go with here. I get it. We can probably poke holes in it. But for the most part, backcountry fly fishing involves having to use specialized equipment to get there. And to be honest with you, it's kind of like the Supreme Court's definition of pornography, right? You know it when you see it. You sort of know when you're doing something that looks like backcountry fly fishing and when you're not doing stuff like backcountry fly fishing. You can call it whatever you want. It makes no difference to me. All I can do is tell you the way that I think about it and the way that I define that term and sort of how my mind works when it comes to gearing up for a trip, preparing myself mentally, thinking through what I'm going to need, and all of that stuff. So there is the definition. And with that, I wanted to bring up the concept of difficulty ratings for fishing. So in hiking, there is this established 5-level difficulty rating system that people refer to often. Okay, so class 1 is you're just hiking on a trail. It's an established trail. It might be a steep trail, it might be a flat trail, but it's just a trail and you're just walking on it. That's class 1. Class 2 is you're starting to get into more difficult hiking that maybe sometimes is off trail. You're probably going to have to climb some pretty steep stuff. You might be going over like loose scree or talus or loose rock. You might have to kind of crawl a little bit sometimes. That's kind of class 2 harder stuff. Class 3 is scrambling. So now you're climbing up over big rocks and doing that kind of stuff. You're probably doing something that looks like climbing, but usually without a rope. So crossing a big nasty boulder field or something like that is class 3 hiking. And you've got class 4 where you're actually climbing. So handholds and footholds are required for upward or downward progress. You have to actually use your hands. You're climbing on this thing. You might use a rope at this stage because if you fall, it's going to be bad news. And then you have class 5, which is technical climbing. Like you're climbing up a vertical rock wall, handholds, that all this kind of stuff that you would expect with that. So those are the 5 difficulty ratings for hiking. People use them often. I think we have a 5 rating difficulty scale for fly fishing as well. And so I have, over the years, kind of come up with a system that I think loosely accommodates the different levels of difficulty for fly fishing. So level 1 fly fishing, there are 5 levels here, not just 3, because I think we needed a little bit more nuance. But level 1 is car fishing, right? So this is like, I get in my car and I drive to the nearest river, maybe it's Deckers. I pull into a parking spot, I get out, I put on my waders, I get in the river, and I fish. Okay? That is level 1 fishing. I drove there, I got out, I didn't have to go very far. I hopped in. If anything goes wrong, my truck's right there. I'm going to go get back in it, turn around, drive home. No muss, no fuss, no problem. Level 2 fishing is more like you drive there, you park in a lot, and now you're going to have to hike into this area, right? So this could be, but it's more populated than a really remote wilderness area. So, for instance, there are some streams on the Front Range where you need to park. You're going to have to hike. It might be half a mile. It might be a full mile in there. Cheeseman Canyon is a good and very well-known example of this. There is a hike involved, but you're definitely not going to be alone in there, right? There are other people around. It's highly trafficked. If you fall and break your leg, somebody's probably going to notice. They're going to call for help. There are other people there to help you out. Same thing. You get back to the lot. You got a flat tire. There is somebody there to help you out. That's level 2. Okay. Level 3 is you are hiking in, but there are not as many people there, and it's a day trip. You're not staying over, right? So this is, you drive out to a more remote section of river, you strap on your hiking boots, you put your stuff in a pack, and you walk 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 miles, whatever, into a canyon or a mountain system or a mountain range or anywhere to get to a stream or get to a lake, but with the idea that you are not far enough out that you can get back to your car if you needed to, right? So this is the majority of my fishing. I think this is probably the majority of most people's fishing in the backcountry is this level 3 spot. where I'm going someplace, I'm going to have to hike in. My personal limit for hike ins in a single day is 5 miles in, 5 miles out. Outside of that, with fishing in between, it starts to get pretty tiring, and I start thinking about camping, which is a higher level. But most of my backcountry fishing is this. You'll go and you'll park, you'll hike in somewhere. You're probably not going to see a lot of people. Maybe you see one or two, depends on the time. But you're not totally isolated. Like somebody doesn't need a helicopter to get to you, right? So that's level 3. Level 4 is the same thing, but now you have to camp, right? So you're out there camping, you can't access it because it's too long of a hike, or it's too far out, or you need too much special gear, or whatever. You're going to hike in, you're probably not going to see a ton of people, and now you are out of reach of your car. So once you get in there, you're kind of on your own. The chances of you being able to turn around and hike out are relatively low, especially with daylight and weather considerations, and you're going to have to stay out there for the night. So level 4 is like backpacking. You get on a trail, you go in, you set up your tent, and either you fish right then, or maybe the next day you wake up like I just did this week, and then you have to go up to the next place so that you can fish because it's just too far to walk in a single day. But level 4 is you can't do it in a single day, right? It's not a day trip. Now you're talking about backpacking and overnight camping. That is a whole different level of complexity, a whole different level of difficulty, because now you got to think about camping. Even if you're car camping, you have to think about the stuff that you need. Did you bring enough food? Did you bring enough water? Do you have water filters? What about warm clothes? How's your tent? Is your sleeping bag good? That's a whole different level of stuff that the angler has to think about, and that's why it's higher up on the difficulty scale at level 4. Level 5 is that, but we're talking about stuff that is really remote. So level 5 would be, as an example, I did this week. You hike up to an area, you set up your camp, you get all your stuff together, you sleep. The next day you wake up and you go someplace that is off trail. And level 5, in my mind, the top difficulty of this is off trail pathfinding. So at this point, you're no longer on an established trail. You don't have trail signs. You don't have a trail map. You can't really download all trails, and it's not going to show you where to go. You have to sit down, look at topographic maps, look at satellite images, and plan out how you're going to get there. And then you have to go do it, right? You have to go overland. You have to go off trail, and you got to find your way to this place. In my case, this week, it was a lake at about 12,000 feet. No trail up there, right? So I hiked in, I set up my camp, I slept for the night, I got up, strapped on my boots, got my day pack, and then I off-trailed for about 2.5 miles up into the wilderness to get to this lake that very few people access up at 12,000 feet because it has golden trout in it. And that's a trout that I would love to catch here in Colorado. Now, this particular trip did not end with success. I'll tell that story here in a little bit. I got forced off the mountain by weather, but I went up there, and it required a lot of pre-planning. It required a lot of thought before I got up there, and I had to go completely sort of off of my own intuition and my own planning. There was no trail, no marker. There aren't Google reviews. There's nothing online about it. You just have to figure it out. That's level 5, right? So now you are not only way off in the wilderness, away from people, not only are you out of reach of your car and potentially your stuff, but if you get in trouble, you're off trail, you're way, way out there, and you don't know if anybody's going to be able to get to you, right? Or if they are going to get to you, it might be a while, right? So this scale, as much as it is a difficulty scale, is also sort of a risk scale, with level 1 being the lowest risk. Something happens, whatever, you get in your car and you drive home, or the next guy down the road pulls over and asks you what's wrong and calls the police. Level 2, a little bit more, you could get hurt, but still somebody's going to help you out. Level 3 starts to get a little different, and by the time you get to level 5, you're really talking about serious self-reliance at this point. If you make a bad decision, if you do something stupid, if something freak goes wrong, you get hit by lightning, you slip on a boulder field and break your leg, well, you're in trouble. I'm not going to say you're definitely going to die. Somebody could come get you with a helicopter, or maybe you have a GPS system that tells them where you are. We can talk about that more later too. But even then, you might be out there for a while, right? These are the people that are stuck on the side of a mountain for a day or 2 days or 3 days while rescue crews are trying to get to them. And sometimes the crews don't get to them. So the level of risk kind of escalates as you go further up the scale. And here's the thing. All of these difficulty ratings theoretically could fit into backcountry fly fishing, right? So going back to that example I had before, a level 1 backcountry trip, might be that you 4x4 up a fairly established 4x4 road, you park, you get out, you fish. Still backcountry, but in terms of difficulty, it's level 1. Conversely, if that same road never sees any people and it's super gnarly and you roll your truck over 10 miles in and nobody knows where you are, well, that could be a problem, right? You could be talking about a level 4 or level 5 at that point. So these difficulty ratings don't necessarily factor into whether or not something is backcountry. They're just a way to sort of think through how hard your day of fishing is going to be, to think through what you're going to need to have a good day of fishing in those conditions and knowing what you're getting into, and just to sort of frame in your head any given trip. Okay, this is a level 1. I don't have to stress. It's just a calm Wednesday. I'm going to go fish. Versus a level 5, which is man, I should really sit down, think about this, make sure all my gear is dialed in, really, really make sure that people know where I'm going and all of that stuff. You've got a lot more prep going into a riskier day of fishing than you do going into a less risky day of fishing. So that's kind of how I think about it. That's how I think about fishing in any given trip. It informs how I do it. It informs what I take. It informs who I take in a lot of cases, right? There's stuff where I just wouldn't want to do it alone, even though I do the vast majority of my fishing solo. There are certain cases where that risk equation flips the wrong way, and now I feel like I need to have somebody else there with me for safety, for me or for them. But that is the basic framework into which I sort of put this backcountry fly fishing stuff. So you can agree with it. You can disagree with it. You can come up with your own difficulty rating. You can throw eggs at me. You can do whatever you want. It actually doesn't matter because it's just fishing and we're pretty much making all this shit up anyway. But as a guy who spends 100 days a year out there, many of those in what I would consider to be backcountry situations, this is the way that my brain works, and it's the way that I think about this fly fishing game. So there we are. You have your definition. You have your difficulty ratings. Now let's talk about the guiding principles of fly fishing. So I mentioned in the last episode that my day job is as a government relations professional. So I work with clients on public policy issues. Very often I find that they have trouble making decisions about public policy issues because they don't have a very clear set of decision-making criteria. They don't have a rubric they can run this stuff through. And so over the course of time in my professional life, I have come up with the idea of guiding principles, right? So these are simple, concise principles that you can use to help you make decisions. You can use them super formally, where you actually sit down and run every decision through each principle and use them as sort of a checklist. It's okay, do I meet number 1? Yeah, I meet number 1. You check it off. You go to number 2. You can do it that way. You can use them more as a loose construct where maybe you're not trying to meet all of them all the time, but you need to have them in your head so that you can make good decisions and be informed about where you want to go. What you don't want to do is completely ignore them because if you don't have guiding principles, you don't have some code of decision making or process for decision making and code of conduct and ethics, you're going to have a bad time because you just don't have any reference point. And like almost everything else in life, if you don't have a good reference point, it's really hard to make good choices. Okay, so in the professional world, if you make a bad choice, you could lose some money, you could lose your job, you could lose a promotion. All those things are bad, so I don't mean to minimize them, but you're probably not going to die, right? Or you're not going to sustain a life-altering injury, probably, depending on your line of work, I suppose. When you're out in the backcountry, though, and when you're fly fishing in general, that's not necessarily true, right? You can make a bad decision and go for a swim in the river with a heavy backpack and waders and not come up at the end of it. You can make a bad decision and slip in a boulder field and break your leg off in the middle of nowhere and not have a GPS locator with you and maybe not get out of that, right? Or you could hurt your back backpacking because you didn't do something right. You loaded it wrong. It was too much. You stepped wrong. And then you're injured and somebody has to come out and get you. But there are potentially life-altering consequences to not making good decisions when you are out in the wild. That's not to say that it's always has to be some kind of scary thing, that you have to be stressed out all the time, that you need to be worried about it every time you're out there. But it does mean that you need to be aware of the fact that you need to make good choices, right? And when you're out in nature, nature doesn't care about you. And if you make bad choices, well, bad things can happen to you. And they can and do happen to people all the time. I just heard a story not too long about two guys who got lost in the desert because they didn't know how to read a map. And one of them wound up dying just over a ridge that was only 15 minutes from where they parked because they just got hopelessly lost and couldn't find their way back. And history is full of these stories. People that had terrible things happen to them, up to and including death, that was easily avoidable had they just made good choices. And these guiding principles are really designed to help you make good choices. So there are 5 of them. I'm going to work through each of them. Again, you may agree or disagree with any part of them. You can make your own guiding principles as you go. You can add to them, you can subtract from them. But this is the culmination of me spending many hundreds of days off fly fishing in various places, almost all of them new, many of them remote. This is where my head goes when I have to make a call. And I should add, this decision might be before you go. Some of them might be decisions you make in the field where, do I want to climb that rock? Yes or no. Do I want to wade that deep looking section? Yes or no. They could also be decisions that you make before you leave the house. So these guiding principles should inform not just your time on the water, but how you get ready for your time on the water, right? And you can run through these while you're prepping for a trip and deciding which gear to take and which gear to leave, or you can run through them while you're out there. But the basic rubric, the basic principles apply the same either way. So with that, I'll shut up. Here's number 1. Number 1 is a cliche, but it's important, and it is safety first, okay? I know we've all heard it to the point that it's almost a joke, right? We go safety first as a meme or something like that. I get it. It's kind of cliche, but really, when you are out in the bush fly fishing, doing anything that even kind of looks like backcountry, safety has to come first. And the reason for that is, like I said, nature doesn't care about you. It's beautiful. You love it. It speaks to you. It calms your spirit. It's therapeutic for you. That's good. It will absolutely kill you or hurt you if you are not paying attention. And if you're lazy or you're unprepared or you're uneducated about it, you can and eventually you will have a bad time. It's like that old Johnny Cash song. You can run on for a long time, but sooner or later, nature is going to cut you down, right? So I don't know whether that'll happen this year, next year, 10 years from now. I meet guys all the time who say, I've never had an issue with this. Well, okay. You've probably also never had a massive medical condition that required medical insurance, but you have that. Most of you haven't died, I don't think, but you have life insurance. The idea that it hasn't happened to you does not mean that it can't happen to you, and that is a terrible way to think about it. So when you're going into the backcountry, you need to think about safety first, right? And like I said, this starts before you ever leave the house. So when you're sitting there getting ready for, say, a backpacking trip, and you just don't want to carry that extra 2 pounds for a backup battery pack for your phone, which you're using for navigation. Or you feel like, man, I don't want to carry 2 water filters. I'm just going to carry 1 water filter. Or here's my favorite one. I'm not going to carry any extra food because I'm just going to eat the fish that I am going to catch while I'm out there. Those are bad choices, right? Just like going out in the backcountry without some kind of personal locator beacon when you're in remote areas that can tell people where you are and then has an SOS function. If you choose to go out without those things for the sake of convenience because they weigh too much or they're annoying or you just don't feel like it or you don't want to run through a checklist with your gear, you can and you will eventually have a bad time because you are prioritizing something other than safety. And so whenever you're making decisions about getting out there and going out and the gear you're going to need, think about that. Think, am I making this decision on the basis of safety or am I making this decision on the basis of convenience or weight or anything else, right? Don't be that guy. Bring the stuff that you need to be safe. Carry an emergency blanket. Carry a personal locator beacon. Carry a fire starter. Carry plenty of water. I ran into a guy not too long ago at a creek up north of Denver. Not serious wilderness, but far enough out that he could have got himself in trouble. He had gotten himself lost off the trail with nothing but a Nalgene and a pair of flip-flops, okay? That is a perfect example of making bad choices. Had I not found that guy, I don't know what would have happened to him. At the very least, he would have had the scariest experience of his life, and at the worst, he could have wandered off, gone missing, and never been found again, okay? Safety means that you think about what you're bringing, and if you have to make a choice between yes or no on having an item or whatever, the answer is yes, if it means that you're safer, right? So that's the very first lens. And then that also applies when you're out there. So just this past week, as I mentioned, I off-trailed up to this lake at 12,000 feet to catch golden trout, which in Colorado are incredibly rare, right? This is one of the only lakes where you can get them. It took me forever to research this place, weeks of planning and preparation and getting ready. And then I got to hike my stuff up there and camp and go up to the lake and yada, 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 yada. I get up there. I'm fishing for 10 minutes, maybe. And I see the golden trout start to rise. There's still ice on the lake, but they're coming up. They're eating midges on the surface. And I'm tying on my Griffiths net, and I get like 4 casts before I look up over the rim of the mountain and I see this insane storm system come over. It's black and the clouds are flying by at 60 miles an hour and it's starting to rain and there's some rumbling in the distance. This is another one of those places where the guiding principles matter, right? Should I stay or should I go? That's the binary question in front of you. In this case, I'm days invested in this thing, weeks invested in this thing, and I just want the one damn fish so I can take the picture and put it on Instagram and have it for my memory because I did this thing and conquered this lake. But I had to make a decision. So what decisions did I make? Well, I stared at the clouds a little bit. I looked at the fish a little bit. I cussed a little bit. I was not happy about this. And then I packed up my stuff and I put on my rain jacket and I hiked my butt all the way back down that 1.5 mile stretch off trail through a bunch of boulder fields back down to my camp. I didn't like doing that. It wasn't the decision that I wanted to make, but it was the decision that I needed to make with safety first in mind. The weather cleared up later. It actually cleared about 1.5 hours later. Blue skies. And by that time, I'm all the way back down, and I don't have the legs or the gas or the time to go back up to the lake. And there was part of me that wondered, man, could I have just ridden this thing out? Could I have just waited it out? And the answer in this case was yes, I could have. But had I made that decision, I would have been making that decision on the basis of me wanting to catch these fish rather than on the basis of safety. And yeah, it could have turned out to be okay this time. It might not have, right? It might have turned into the most violent storm I've ever been in, and I'm exposed to lightning at 12,000 feet above timberline or climbing over rain-slick boulders way off in the middle of nowhere. It could have gone really, really badly. And so even though I was frustrated, even though I just felt kind of defeated, now I have to go back to this place, it was the right decision to make with safety first in mind. And obviously there are a lot of other examples like that, right? Should you go fish during runoff in a heavy stream that's running at 1,000 CFS when it usually runs at 100 CFS? Probably not. Right? You need to make a choice there that makes sense. Should you go snowshoe up to a stream or a lake when you know that there's a high avalanche risk, even though you know that ice off can be some of the best fishing up there? Probably not. It's probably not a good thing to do. And if you use the safety first lens to make your decisions, your life will be much better. And best of all, your life will still be your life because you won't be dead and you won't be injured. And hopefully you will have many, many years of continuing to do this fly fishing and this backcountry fly fishing thing. So that's number one, safety first. Number two, also kind of cliche, but man, based on my experience out there, it bears repeating. Leave no trace, right? Nobody wants to see your shit on the trail. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be the guy that tells you that. They don't want to see your graffiti on the trees. They don't want to see your painted rocks. They definitely don't want to see your toilet paper scattered around on the floor or the ground. They don't want to see your wrappers. They don't care that you love Melissa and that you drew a little heart into the tree bark. They don't want to find your fly line or your fishing line or your old shoes or your dog poop. They don't want those things, right? People want to be out in the wilderness to enjoy the wilderness from sort of the main perspective. But beyond that, nature doesn't need that. These places have existed for millions upon millions of years, eons, without you. They don't need you to enhance them. Okay, they don't need you to build a rock cairn. They don't need you to paint a rock. They don't need you to carve that heart into the tree. They don't need to know that Jeff was here or whoever you are. And by the way, Jeff, I found your little sign up at the lake. I don't appreciate it. Nobody cares. Just don't be that guy. Don't take anything with you. Don't leave anything up there. Just don't mess with it, right? And this comes also back to your behavior. So I was up fishing a lake not too long ago, a little bit over 12,000 feet for cutthroat. And I'm standing down there fishing below a little rocky ledge. So the people above me on the trail probably couldn't see me down at the shore. And suddenly I hear this whoosh and a rock goes flying past my head and splashes into the water. So it blows up my shot at this big, beautiful cutthroat that I was casting to. Then another rock, whoosh, other side of me, flies into the water. And number one, this goes back to safety first. Don't throw rocks off trails ever, 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 because you never know who's below you. And there are tons of examples of people being hit and injured or killed like that. But number two, the lake doesn't need you to do that. There are already rocks in there. Those rocks have probably been laying in exactly the place where they're laying for longer than you and anybody who has ever borne your name has existed. You don't need to move them. It's not required. You just shouldn't do that. If you kick a rock while you're walking, okay, fine, that's fine. But do you need to pick up a football-sized rock and throw it into the water and scare a bunch of fish and alter the bottom, the natural bed of that lake? No, you just don't need to do that. Go up, take pictures. That's all you should be taking. And like the saying goes, just leave nothing but footprints, okay? We don't want to find it. You can keep your pictures, you can keep your memories, you can brag about it to your friends. But otherwise, just leave no trace. Don't be that guy, okay? That's number 2. So when you're making your choices up there about what you do and how you commemorate your trip and everything else, that should be your first line of thinking is how do I get out of here without leaving any evidence that I was ever here and without ruining it for the next guy or for nature itself. That's number 2. Number 3, understanding equals enjoyment. Okay, so this one's a little bit more complicated, but here's the thing. Nature is simultaneously very simple. You'll hear people say, well, I want to get out in nature because it's so much simpler and it's just so nice to be in a simpler place. And it's also a lot more complicated, right? There's a lot going on in these ecosystems. That's why people go to school for years to get bachelor's and master's and PhDs in ecology and biology and geology and everything else. Because nature's actually not that simple. There is a lot happening around you at any given time. You have the weather, you have the atmospheric conditions, you have the rain patterns, you have animal behavior and animal patterns, you have vegetation and vegetation patterns, insect patterns for us fly fishermen that are out there, fish who behave differently depending on water temperature and water conditions and water turbidity and everything else. There is a lot going on around you in nature that if you were to stop and think about it and study it and learn about it, you would enjoy your time out there so much more. Okay, so when I go out there, when I first started, it's like you walk out and it's just this wondrous experience. You're like, wow, it's a tree, and wow, it's a moose, and over here, oh my God, it's a bear print. And it's cool and it's exciting, but until you really take the time to understand where you are and to understand what's going on around you, you're never going to reach peak enjoyment, right? And so whenever you're going out into nature, this doesn't even matter if it's backcountry or not. You should want to understand where you are. And when you have a choice between going out there and being that guy that just chucks some flies around for a while and catches some fish, but you don't really know why you caught the fish, you just did, and that's pretty cool, check out my pictures, or being the guy that says, okay, what are the flows today? What's the temperature like? What's the water temperature like? What is the bottom vegetation looking like right now? What are the hatch cycles that I'm looking at? Just from a fishing perspective, you're going to have more fun because you're going to understand why you're catching the fish, right? And because you put in the work to reading the books or the blog posts or listening to the podcast or whatever you're doing to go and seek out the information so that when you go outside, you can recognize the patterns and recognize, at least on some level, there's always going to be some stuff you can't answer, but understand what's going on around you, okay? And that's not just for fish. Fishing, obviously, it matters because understanding that stuff is going to directly influence how well you fish and therefore how many fish you catch and therefore how much fun you have. Let's be real. It's more fun to catch fish. But also the other stuff, right? So understanding what it means when you find a fresh pile of bear scat 50 feet from your tent, right? Or if you're on a game trail and you're seeing huge moose prints the size of your head or moose scat all over an area. Or you come into a marshy area that looks like it might be kind of moosey because you happen to know from your study that moose really enjoy these marshy areas where they can eat woody bushes and everything else that keeps them alive. Or understanding weather patterns, right? So when you feel that sudden drop in temperature, you know there's probably something coming. And it might be time for you to think about getting out of there or moving to higher ground or whatever you need to do, or lower ground, depending on how high you up, I guess. But all of that kind of stuff is going to lead to you having a better time. It is going to lead to you being safer and more effective out there. And it is going to lead to just a generally better experience for you. Okay, so I tend to believe, yes, it's just fishing. Yes, it's just hiking. It's just camping. It can be simple, I guess. But if you really want to go out and you really want to respect nature and understand nature and learn about it and connect with it on that sort of intellectual, scientific level, you got to do some homework. right? And so that's why the third guiding principle is understanding equals enjoyment. Do your homework, do your reading, do your research, do your best to ask questions and be curious and be inquisitive about what's happening around you. And you're going to wind up being a better fisherman. You're going to wind up being a better woodsman. You're going to wind up being just all around a better outdoor person than you would if you were just out there messing around with very little understanding of what's happening around you. So that's number 3. Number 4, respect the fish. Okay. You are out there, in this case, to fly fish. You are there to catch probably trout. There are some instances where maybe you're looking for grayling or something, but you're probably looking for trout. Trout, as we all should know, are relatively delicate creatures. They're maybe not quite as delicate as we think they are all the time, but they're not largemouth bass. Okay. They're not pike. They are not sea fish that weigh 600 pounds. They're fairly delicate, cold water fish. Every time you go onto Reddit or Facebook or Instagram and you see a picture of a guy holding a fish with dry hands, or he's got him in the dirt with like rocks stuck to his face, or he's got his finger up the thing's gills and he's holding it up, or he's lipping it like a bass, it just makes every single fly fisherman cringe inside. Like, it physically hurts us. Because these fish are in this sort of symbiotic relationship with us, right? They're out there doing their thing. We love to catch them. But because we love to catch them, we want to protect them. And we want to provide a safe habitat where they can grow and they can get bigger and they can be successful so that we can go and catch them, right? And so there's a vested interest in it. And over time, that develops into a respect for the fish. You respect that they're selective, and that's what makes fly fishing fun. You respect that they're wild animals that really shouldn't be messed with beyond what you're doing, I guess, already by catching them. And really, most of all, don't need to be needlessly killed or don't need to be made to suffer needlessly. You can go out, catch your fish, keep them in the damn water. Just keep them wet. Don't drag them up on the rocks. Okay, fish are fish. They live in the water. They're not made to be on land ever. There is really never a time where a living fish should ever touch the ground, and certainly not a trout. You just don't need to do that. Keep them in the water. You don't need to hold them by the gills. Their gills are very, very sensitive. It's kind of like if somebody reached into you and like fingered your lung. It wouldn't feel good, and it probably wouldn't be good for you. Don't do that. You can just hold them normally. They're not that big. Maybe you caught the world's biggest 40-inch brown trout and you need some help. I get it. There might be times where you need to have somebody help you, or there might be a unique situation. Most of your trout are somewhere between 8 inches and 20 inches, right? They're not that big, and they're not that hard to hold for a picture or to look at or for whatever you want to do. You don't need to hold them by the lip like they're a bass. You're going to break their lip. You don't need to hold them by the gills. You don't need to grab them so hard around the middle that you're squeezing their heart, squeezing their organ like a banana. You just don't need to do those things. You can just hold them normally, carefully, get your picture for 5 seconds, and put them back in the water so they can breathe, okay? So remember, these fish, when you caught them, they just had to fight for their life. They had to run like crazy, like fighting a UFC fighter. They're exhausted. They're out of breath. And if you hold them out of the water after that, it is like you having the hardest fight of your life against Mike Tyson in his prime, and then having somebody shove a plastic bag over your head for 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes so you can't breathe. It's not going to go well. At the very least, it's not going to feel well or feel good. And at the worst, it might kill you. Something bad could happen there. So just don't be that guy. If you're going to fish for trout, especially if you're going to fly fish for trout, please respect the fish. Okay, it's not that hard to Google how to handle a trout. It's out there. Every forum in the world has information about trout handling. There are hundreds of articles, hundreds of podcasts, videos on YouTube. Just take 5 minutes, going back to the last guiding principle about understanding. Take 5 minutes to educate yourself about the ethics of trout fishing and how to handle these animals. And by the way, yes, this also includes if you're going to keep the fish. If you want to keep a fish and it's legal where you are, fine, knock yourself out. I am 100% catch and release. I have been for a very long time. I don't enjoy killing stuff and I don't feel a need to. But if you want to do it and it's legal, sure, keep a brook trout. Eat it for dinner at the camp. It doesn't matter. But even then, respect the animal enough to give it a quick, clean death. Don't throw it on a stringer and let it suffer. Don't throw it into a ice chest and let it die flopping around on cold, hard, sharp ice. You just don't need to do that. Kill it, bleed it, prep it, eat it. Just, there's no reason to be cruel. You should respect the quarry that we're chasing. more than that. And this goes beyond just trout handling, right? It also goes into a little bit more of that understanding piece. So, for instance, you don't want to be fishing for trout in a river when it's above 68 degrees. And I know some people say 65. My cutoff is 68 degrees. There's less oxygen in warmer water. So trout need a lot of oxygen. That is why they prefer colder water. As those water temps go up, there is less and less dissolved oxygen in the water. That means it's harder for them to breathe, right? So going back to that analogy, if you were to catch a fish in, say, 72-degree water, drag them through the water, fight them, get them in the net, that fish basically just had that same 10-round fight against Mike Tyson that I mentioned, but now he's having to recover halfway up Mount Everest, right? Or all the way up Mount Everest where there's no oxygen for him. So you can imagine how you feel in that situation and how that would go for you. It probably wouldn't go very well and you might die. And that's what happens with fish. So if you're out there fishing in really warm water and you're catching fish, understand that those fish have a better than average chance of dying, or at the very least, they're going to have a lot of suffering. And so there's a time when the water's too warm or the conditions just aren't right. Maybe it's too low and the fish are isolated in these little puddles, these little pockets. Maybe there's been some kind of environmental catastrophe where, like for instance, on the Poudre River here in Colorado, where there was a huge fire in one of the tributaries, then there was a flood over the burn scar. It washed a ton of silt and a ton of debris and ash down the river and killed almost every fish down the river. You probably shouldn't be fishing for them in those conditions. Those fish have much bigger stuff to worry about. They're having a bad time, and you just don't need to be out there stressing them for your own enjoyment. Okay, make a better choice and come up with choices when you're out there angling and before you go, to understand the fish and to respect the fish. Okay. Now look, I know somebody out there is like a PETA person, and they're going to tell me, well, fly fishing is a blood sport. You're sticking a hook in a wild animal's mouth and dragging it around the water, and you should just get over yourself because really, you're no better than anybody else, and you should just stop fishing if you are worried about hurting fish. Okay, I'm willing to accept that that's fair, right? Fly fishing by nature involves putting a sharp object into a fish's mouth, and I guess dragging them through the water until you put them in a net. But really, if you're doing it correctly, I understand it might stress the fish out. I don't necessarily believe that fish feel pain. I know there's some science out there that can go either way. But having observed a great deal of fish who still have hooks in their mouths, they don't really care until you start pulling on them. They don't like having their heads pulled off center because it's unnatural. I don't think they're experiencing crushing pain. I think that they recover pretty quickly so long as you are doing respectful things like using barbless hooks. But yeah, I do have to make peace with the fact that some small percentage, 1 or 2%, based on most of the research that I've seen of the fish that you catch, even catch and release perfectly, they might die. That could happen. Okay, I accept that. But I do everything in my power to enjoy the sport without putting down the fly rod and becoming a member of PETA, without hurting fish unnecessarily. Some level of random chance can happen. I can screw up. Something can go bad. And yes, I have to accept the fact that that could mean that at least some of these fish are injured or die. That's part of it. It does not mean that I have carte blanche to go out and do whatever I want to the fish, because 1% of them are going to die anyway. And so therefore I am going to mistreat 100% of them because who cares? That's broken logic. It makes you a bad fisherman, and it kind of makes you a bad person, to be honest, to go out and treat animals that way unnecessarily. So accidents happen, statistical anomalies happen, bad stuff happens sometimes, but it really shouldn't happen due to a conscious choice on your part to not treat the animal with respect. Don't be that guy, for real. That's number 4. All right, number 5, be prepared for surprises, okay? So when you go out in the backcountry, this kind of goes back to the first guiding principle of safety first, and a little bit back to understanding and guiding principle number 3. But you need to realize that every time you go fishing, it's going to be a different time, and you just don't know what's going to happen, right? So it may be that you go out in a relatively quiet stream and you're fishing and doing your thing, and then suddenly there's a flash flood and you see a wall of water come down the canyon. What do you do at that point, right? What is the correct response to that? You better know that before you go out there, and you better be prepared for those potentially unexpected events before you go out there, or you could have a lot of trouble, okay? Same thing like the guy that I found up in northern Colorado in that sort of backcountry creek. You might find somebody out there who is hurt and who doesn't have the equipment that they need. Maybe they don't have medical supplies. Maybe they don't have a personal locator beacon. Maybe they didn't tell anybody where they were going. Maybe they're having an emotional crisis. Those things can happen, and you need to go with the mindset that these things could happen and that you need to be prepared, at least on some basic level, to deal with them. Tagging on to that thing, you can go out and have an unexpected shift in weather. And if you don't have the right gear to deal with that unexpected shift, you're going to have a bad time. You could lose your only water filter. You could break your rod, right? I can't tell you how many times in my early years of fly fishing, I would go out and I would get to the river and I would break my rod because I was stupid. I didn't know what I was doing. And sometimes I still break rods now, even though I think I like to pretend that I know what I'm doing. And I didn't have a backup rod. So then I guess I can't fish anymore. So you have to get back in the car and drive all the way home and then deal with that. Now I bring 2 rods and I bring 2 reels, not because I expect something bad to happen, but because I understand that surprises do happen anytime you're out in the backcountry, right? Same thing for animals. You could run into a bull moose who doesn't like you. You could have a bear eat all of your food while you're sleeping because you didn't secure it right. You can, like I did this week, have a monstrous rainstorm that blows through while you're trying to sleep and destroys your tent and gets all your stuff wet. And if you didn't bring a change of clothes, well, you're probably going to have a bad time. Did I expect the rainstorm? No, I didn't. It wasn't in the forecast, but it happened. And thankfully, I had expected that something like that maybe could happen. And as a result, I was prepared. So when you go out there, just be cautious of that sort of rhythm where you say, I've done this before. I know what's going to happen. There aren't going to be any surprises, because you could be surprised, and you need to be prepared to be surprised because nature's weird and people are weird and stuff happens out there that you just didn't expect. So it pays to be ready to go and to deal with that stuff. That could be mental readiness where you're like, man, one day this could happen and here's what I would do. It could be intellectual readiness where you understand what you're supposed to do if you run across a fire or a dead body or a flash flood or whatever you might see. That could be part of it. It could be gear, right? It could be, okay, what do I need to have with me if this remote possibility were to happen within reason? Obviously, you don't have to carry, a surgical kit with you out there. You just need to have enough to be safe and to keep others safe. But be prepared for the unexpected because that is part of the game and always will be. It's just inherently unpredictable out there. All right. And then here is one last guiding principle, number 6, which is that failure is an acceptable outcome. Okay. And I know that might be tough to swallow. It might be tough to understand what I mean by that. Of course, nobody wants to go out into the backcountry and fail. Certainly, we want to go catch fish. We want to reach the place that we were trying to reach. We want it to be an amazing success that we can share with others. But man, sometimes it doesn't happen. And one of the upsides of always fishing new places or fishing remote places is that you get to see new stuff. You don't ever get bored. You always have a new challenge in front of you, a new mountain to conquer, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively. But the downside of that is that sometimes it doesn't work out. You can get 4 or 5 miles into a blue lining trip where you're picking a little blue line on Google Maps and you're like, man, I think there might be fish in there. And you hike in there, and there are no fish in there. Or you might try to hike up to an alpine lake a little too early, trying to catch ice off, and man, still frozen. Or you could have what happened to me this week happen, which is that you reach your destination and the weather is terrible and you have to come down off the top of the mountain. And that is a bummer, but it has to happen. Or you might not reach the destination at all. You could get yourself into a situation where you just can't get there. The weather's too bad. The route that you plotted out is not correct. The terrain is too hard. One way or another, you just can't reach the place and you have to call it a day. Or maybe none of that happens and you get there and the weather's great and you have no issues and everything's perfect and you never even see a fish, right? That happens a lot, especially with high alpine lakes. You just don't ever even see a fish. They don't exist. It's like they don't exist in the lake. They're too deep or they winter killed and they're not there anymore, or the conditions are just wrong, or they're trying to spawn or whatever. There are a million things that could happen. And all of those really look like failure, right? You didn't get what you wanted. It didn't go the way that you planned. And that's okay, right? So this kind of ties into all the rest of them. That is going to happen to you when you fly fish in the backcountry. It absolutely is. And it's going to happen to you more often than you'd probably like to admit. That is the risk. It is the gamble. It's the dice roll. in some ways, it's the thing that makes this so exciting and so fun. But you have to keep in mind that if your safety is in jeopardy, or if something's just not right, or if it's not working out, or conditions don't allow it, or something happens, or you just can't catch fish, that's okay. You still went. You still got to explore. You still got out there. You still learned something. If you think hard enough, you're going to find at least one thing that you learn pretty much every trip when you're pushing and going to these new places. But it might be a failure on paper. And if you're going to do this kind of fishing, if this is where you want to go, if these are the kind of places you want to see and the kind of experiences you want to have, you are going to have to make peace with the fact that failure is going to happen to you. And you're going to have to make peace with the fact that failure is an acceptable outcome on any one of these backcountry expeditions. That's just part of it. The earlier in the game you make peace with that and accept it, the happier you're going to be, the more you're going to be able to enjoy your time outside without the stress of feeling like a failure. And frankly, the better off you're going to be and the safer you're going to be, because you can make better choices when you accept the fact that failure is a possible outcome and it's actually an acceptable outcome in the backcountry. So there you have it. Those are the 6 guiding principles of backcountry fly fishing. I might add more to them later. I might change them later. Maybe at some point down the road, we'll do an episode where we say, here are the revised guiding principles of fly fishing. But for now, this is where they are. And like I said, they're all made up anyway, so we can just kind of change them. You can add to them or modify them however you want. But these are the things that run through my head when I'm thinking about fishing, when I'm thinking about getting ready for fishing, when I am fishing, when I'm leaving from fishing. These are the items that I use to make decisions about everything from how I prep to how I fish to how I behave when I'm outside. All right. So take them as a starting point, use them, craft them, make them whatever you want. But do think about how you can be prepared, how you can have a code of behavior while you're out there, and how you can just not be that guy when it comes to being outside, and how you can keep yourself safe. So at the end of the day, you can come back to your family, show off your fish pictures to your friends, and be in a good spot to remember the great days you've had, as opposed to having some kind of traumatic life-altering event that sticks with you forever. So I think that's worth it. We covered the definition of backcountry fly fishing. We covered the 5 levels of fishing difficulty, at least in my mind. And then we covered the guiding principles of backcountry fly fishing, which, like I said, subject to change, but at least for now as a baseline before we jump into some of these other discussions, will serve as a pretty good foundation. So hope you enjoyed it. If you agreed, then shoot me a note. If you disagreed, you can shoot me a note as well and tell me I'm stupid, or maybe add something that we can add to a future podcast. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. But for now, I appreciate you tuning in, and we will see you next time. Until next time, this is Ross. Maybe I'll see you out there, but hopefully not.